No, none of this stuff's hers.
Can you not interrupt me
None
and
of
be quiet
this
for 2
stuff
seconds?
is hers.
I'm talking
then
to her.
You do your job and stop them. There is a legal channel right here. You do your job then. There is a legal channel right here. I have mail right here. You need to do your job and stop them from doing this right now.
This is Susan Bassey, and I want to apologize for the delay in making the announcements that I know many of you have been waiting for. But I sadly need to report a theft from my publishing and production company involving Scott Largent, the Santa Clara County District Attorney, and a number of individuals in the Santa Clara County General Counsel. By way of background, we met Scott Largent on October 2nd, 2017, where he was complaining about Judge Stuart Scott and had a run-in with police officers over that complaint outside the courthouse. We documented that day and we posted it online. For the next several months, Scott Largent began to contact me on numerous occasions, inviting me to meetings, inviting me to film encounters with police officers, and to document what was going on in our local courts. I even filmed this day, May 1st, 2018, where Scott was arrested for protesting outside the family court. Over the year that I had known him, Scott had gotten quite good with his camera, and he would film for me, and I would film for him. On this day in particular, I felt that the police officers were violating the law. They were executing an order by a judge simply to clear the protesters from in front of the court in advance of an election that was very important and that involved the recall of Judge Aaron Persky and the re-election of Jeff Rosen. There were several phone calls that I documented. The police officers were ready to go, and they clearly wanted to remove Scott and other protesters from the front of the courthouse. I knew it was coming, and I knew it was important to record it, and so I did. I'm never mentioned in any of the police reports. The police officers engaged with me. This officer here is one that I complained to about deputies in the courthouse many times, and this officer is Officer Gomez, who is the one who broke my hand on November 14th, 2017, when I was in the courthouse with Mr. Largent documenting excessive force used on him. I knew on this day that they had violated Mr. Largent's First Amendment rights. I knew that they had a federal lawsuit if Mr. Largent had gotten the correct attorney. And it was shortly after I showed this video that the criminal charges against him were dropped. And it was after that that he sent me this text message telling me that the Santa Clara County Council and CEO had offered him a deal. They had offered him money, and they knew that they were in trouble because the case had gotten dropped. Immediately after a number of us had testified before Scott's criminal defense attorney and produced the video that got his charges dismissed, Scott's conduct became increasingly alarming. He was abusive, he was disrespectful, and he started to interfere with our businesses. He interfered with Pam Noodleman's business, and she lost a great deal because of Scott. Pam had been nothing but generous to Scott. She had fed him, she had given him office space, and she had cared for him when his own family wouldn't do it. We trusted Scott, and perhaps wrongly, we believed in him and we believed in his stories. Eventually, Pam Noodleman filed a request to restrain Scott Largent from our offices and from her home. She felt very insecure and threatened by Scott, and she named me as an additional protected party, and that order was filed on July 2nd, 2019. The next day, Santa Clara County District Attorney Jeff Rosen filed a declaration in support of one of his employees in the district attorney's office who I had been investigating for outright fraud and misuse of state and federal funds earmarked for victims in the county. By the time Mr. Rosen filed a declaration attempting to restrain me from the county offices where he worked and the courthouses where he knew I was investigating him, I believed that I had enough information through public records, sources, and whistleblowers to get an indictment of Mr. Rosen and a number of members of his office. In the declaration Mr. Rosen filed on July 3rd, 2019, that was never served on me, he eventually said that my associate got verbally angry with him and followed him to the elevators and said, "Susan Bassey is going to get you. You are an asshole." Mr. Rosen claimed he took this comment as a physical threat and believed that I was encouraging others to incite violence against him, when in fact Mr. Rosen knew darn well that I had only done public records, had no criminal history, and was acting as a journalist and investigative reporter, and he was the target of my investigation. Mr. Rosen knew I had the power to indict him and remove him from office, and that is what frightened him. Mr. Rosen was frightened of journalism. Journalism done well can topple the most powerful individuals in our country, and Mr. Rosen said he needed armed guards to protect him from that journalism and the work that I had done for months against him and a number of his top aides and persons working in victim services. After a hearing in that case, I had the opportunity to attend an event sponsored by the First Amendment Coalition, where a number of lawyers got together and a reporter from San Francisco who had had his property seized and his home invaded by the San Francisco police and the FBI gave a presentation about what it feels like for somebody to steal unpublished journalistic work, to invade your personal space and take your work product. Bryan's story is captivating, and I had the privilege of hearing him talk very candidly about it and his decision to go public, and I will be sharing that later. But I want to share with you how it felt for me to know that Scott Largent was stealing property from me.
I'm not taking anything off of this thing. No, get your hands off my stuff.
Scott!
Get your hands off of my thing. She's grabbing. Tell her to stop.
We know from a case filed by Netflix against one of their former employees that when an employee, a contractor, or a volunteer takes private and proprietary information, and when they give that information to public officials or government authorities in a manner that harms that business, that there are a number of state and federal charges, criminal charges that need to be filed. And these are the things that I'm going to have to address in the days to come.
Let us figure out where to get you somewhere.
You need to drive yourself somewhere and check yourself in.
Okay.
We have like a massive list of people that you screwed over that are victims.
Really?
It was that statement, along with Mr. Largent's text messages and public comments, and a declaration he filed with the assistance of the Santa Clara County District Attorney, that made me realize he had violated my trade secrets and compromised my publishing business. And for that, I have reported him for theft.
Before we get into all the details?
Yes, I'm a publisher, and I own a publishing business, and I'm a journalist, and I have an individual who has stolen information from me and trade secret information from me. And
What information?
well, I don't know the extent of it, but I'm going to give you this phone that he recorded in a courtroom, that he told me he recorded in a courtroom unlawfully without a media request.
In addition to recording in a courtroom unlawfully, Scott Largent stole mail from his grandmother, stole my trade secrets, and gave information to the Santa Clara County District Attorney. He gave information about who my associates were in mainstream media and what I was capable of doing. Undoubtedly, when Mr. Largent gave this information to the Santa Clara County District Attorney, whom I was investigating, and when Mr. Largent threw the most vulnerable of my sources and victims and whistleblowers under the bus for his own self-serving purposes, Mr. Rosen thought that he had something on me that he could criminally prosecute to thwart an investigation of his office. But Mr. Largent will not stop me and my associates from investigating our local elections, and Mr. Rosen's interference with Michelle Dauber, Stanford University professor who had Judge Persky recalled in those elections, and public records show a different narrative than what was told in mainstream media. Mr. Largent's conduct will not stop me from investigating the top people in the DA's office for public corruption and misuse of state and federal funds earmarked for crime victims, or on private judging and minors' counsel appointments, or on police misconduct, or on corrupt judges that happen to be friends of Mr. Rosen's. I may never know why Scott Largent did what he did when he decided to give a declaration to the district attorney and violate my trust, his fiduciary duty, and his duty to loyalty to my publishing business and my sources and my associates who had given so much to Mr. Largent. But I do know why Jeff Rosen did what he did. And I do know why Jeff Rosen is feeling desperate and threatened. And it's not because he fears that I can become violent or harm him physically. Mr. Rosen knows what I'm capable of. He knows who my associates are. Scott Largent has surely given him enough information to know that I'm capable, to know that the people that I associate with change things, get people indicted. They've created the internet, This is, after all, Silicon Valley. We invented the internet, we invented the technology, and if we need to, we can invent the tools to make sure that journalism stays alive and protects our democracy the way that it was intended when they wrote the First Amendment. So I may have lost my trust in the local district attorney and in Scott Largent. And I know that some of you have lost your trust in the police and in our courts. But I hope that you will never lose your trust in journalism and that you always feel that you have someone in the media to call. And for that reason, I'd like to introduce you to some of my friends who I believe will always take those calls.